This video is brought to you by the Logitech Lightspeed Wireless range of keyboards, mice and headsets, the benchmark in wireless gaming performance.
The Medium is a game of two halves. A game where you, playing as Marianne, spend time darting between the world of the living and the world of spirits. This split is central to the game's storytelling, the production of its soundtrack, and the technology powering the game. It could also be said that The Medium walks the line between a next-generation title for two of the latest consoles on the market and a throwback to the early 2000s style of horror adventure games. It's certainly a dark and atmospheric experience. So on today's video, I'd like to walk through my experiences playing The Medium, highlighting its unique presentation style and many of its technical accomplishments. We'll also discuss image quality and performance metrics on both Xbox Series X and Xbox Series S. So, with that in mind, let's dive in to the spirit world. The Medium is the next horror adventure from the Polish game studio Bloober Team, the same group behind titles such as Observer and Layers of Fear. What separates The Medium from its other excursions in the genre, however, lies first and foremost in its perspective. Prior games were first-person affairs, but The Medium instead opts for a third-person gameplay system using fixed camera angles. This in turn helps lend the game a more old-school horror feel. But what separates The Medium from many other games in the genre is its one unique feature, which appears at points throughout the story: the dual viewport display. Essentially, in this mode, the game screen is split in two: the world of the living and the spirit world. During these sections, your control is mirrored, with roadblocks on one side often limiting you on the other. Many of the game's numerous puzzles focus on this aspect of the gameplay. Thus, this is perhaps the game's defining visual feature, and it's also one that's rather ambitious from a technical perspective. The concept at its core is perhaps similar to playing a game in split screen. The game must render two simultaneous viewports, which can be rather demanding, especially with the way modern engines tend to work. So what does this really mean then? Well, basically, while many games using split screen simply render two different viewports of the same map, The Medium is a little different in that you're inhabiting two unique spaces, each with their own set of assets. So not only is the rendering cost increased, but you're also placing more demands on memory and storage. From a rendering perspective, effects such as depth of field, ambient occlusion, motion blur, and more must all be calculated twice, which increases the cost of using each one. Furthermore, DXR accelerated ray tracing is featured in this game, and the acceleration structure must be maintained for both viewports, which of course has its own cost in terms of video memory. So basically, rendering features are more expensive to use, and more VRAM is required to hold things, such as the top-level acceleration structure and various render targets. And of course, faster storage is also a must. It's unlikely that this game would function well on a mechanical hard drive used in the older consoles. It's a neat effect, but one that could have worn out its welcome if used too often. Thankfully, that's not the case in this game. The pacing carefully balances different types of scenarios as you play. For instance, in several areas of the game, rather than playing in split screen, you'll instead use these mirrors to jump back and forth between the real world and the spirit world. The mirrors themselves reflect the movement and position of your character, but serve as a portal to the other side, creating a new effect in the process. During these segments, you can instantly zap between the environments as you work to solve puzzles. The only caveat here is that despite using a fast SSD, I still ran into some texture streaming issues from time to time. Look at Marianne's jacket in this scene, for instance. Speaking of which, I also noticed that when browsing your inventory, simply moving between objects produces this artifact each time. I suppose they're loading and unloading data as you move between objects. Fortunately, during normal gameplay, this does not occur very often, but I was surprised to see it in a game running on the new consoles from such fast SSDs. Despite this, there are some moments in the game which really showcase what the technology can do. Take this chase sequence for instance, where you're escaping a creature here in the woods. The game effortlessly switches between the real world and the spirit world as you run, changing the terrain before your eyes. It's a relatively simple sequence for sure, but just seeing this unfold as you play is really impressive. It's unlikely that a scene like this could work on a last generation console. If we examine the environments themselves, however, this is perhaps where the medium impresses the most. In the world of the living, environments are packed with small, granular details, from the forests surrounding the Neva resort, to nearby ruins, to the abandoned hotel itself. It's all spectacularly realized. The spirit world, then, is inspired by the works of the Polish painter Beksinski, and that connection goes perhaps a little deeper than usual. In this world, the dramatic shift in materials create a very different sensation, and it works exceptionally well. This all sort of ties into what I feel separates the game from other similar titles. It's the setting itself. It's unusual to play a game set in the Polish wilderness in and around an abandoned resort hotel. It lends everything a unique atmosphere that I found rather compelling. Altogether, the medium presents a hauntingly beautiful world to explore. So how about character rendering then? The other part of the puzzle. Well, models themselves are nicely detailed, especially those you encounter on the other side. The representation of these inhabitants is suitably creepy and compelling. But the cutscenes, when human characters are involved, are let down slightly by somewhat stiff animation work, especially when it comes to facial expressions and eye movement. It's somewhat reminiscent of games such as Heavy Rain. Also, Jeff Bezos makes an appearance in this game, and his performance is especially stiff. Sorry, I couldn't resist. In comparison, the actual in-game animation isn't half bad. Within the genre of horror games, though, it feels like a perfect fit, so it kinda makes sense. Still, despite this, I do feel the game is very attractive overall. Now, as noted earlier, the medium is available on both Xbox Series X and Series S, as well as the PC. As this is our first non-cross-gen Xbox game, you might be wondering how it compares between the two consoles then, at least in terms of features and image quality, so perhaps now is the right time to discuss this. Resolution-wise, the medium utilizes dynamic resolution scaling with a wider variation than is typical, most likely due to the dual viewport display used throughout the game. While exploring the world in full screen, resolution tops out at native 4K on Series X and 1080p on the Series S. During these segments, DRS scaling typically averages out around 1440p on X, while Series S is often in the 900p range. However, when exploring in split-screen mode, the minimum resolution drops even further. On Series X, the worst case is around 900p, while on Series S, the worst case seems to be around 648p. This is most likely due to the increased rendering cost of utilizing the dual viewport function. Both versions seem to use Unreal's temporal upsampling capabilities, however, to smooth out the image. Regarding other technical features then, the medium features ray-traced reflections, but only in certain locations and only on Xbox Series X and the PC. That is most obvious in scenes where you can control the camera. Like this, on Series S, note how the reflection disappears as the scene is occluded from view in typical SSR fashion. On Series X, however, the reflection remains accurate as it does not rely on screen space information. This is a nice example of ray-traced reflections. Many other reflections, however, use SSR combined with cube maps, so it kinda goes back and forth. There are other differences as well. Shadows, for instance, are rendered at a lower resolution on Series S versus Series X. All shadows in the medium are traditional rasterized shadows, it should be noted, except for the shadows visible within ray-traced reflections. The reliance on fixed camera angles helps avoid artifacts typically associated with shadow maps, and the result is exceptional. Shadows dance around beautifully as your flashlight passes across the scenery. Unreal Engine 4 contact shadows are also used to improve close proximity detail. The Series S delivers comparable visuals in most scenes and remains an attractive game regardless, but this game does highlight the significant gap in performance between the two machines. While we're on the topic of image quality, I also want to point out a minor detail that impacts specific sequences. When you first begin the game, you might have the impression that the black levels are raised, washing out the image. However, this only applies to specific video-based sequences used during the game's introduction. Once the game flips over to real-time rendering, the black level appears correct, at least when using HDR. I found that when using SDR, the default brightness is perhaps a little too dark, resulting in noticeable black crush. I recommend bumping up the gamma slightly. HDR, however, looks fantastic using the default settings. So at this point, it's clear that this is really a game of two halves, much like its narrative themes. The ability to switch back and forth between the two unique worlds is rather impressive, and the scenery itself is beautifully detailed. At the same time, the animation, specifically in cutscenes, is rather stiff, and the resolution can dip to a lower than expected value, though only in the worst case scenario, it should be noted. Still, given the relatively small size of the studio, I feel the team has done great work in bringing this unique world to life. It's certainly the most impressive game they've produced to date, that's for sure. Pushing forward though, the next point we need to address is performance, and for that we're going to begin with the Xbox Series X version. Primarily what we're looking at here is a 30 frames per second update across the game. This is acceptable for a slow-paced horror adventure. In fact, it's very common with these types of games in general, but there is an issue which I'm sure you can see by looking at the frame time graph. My old nemesis, bad frame pacing, has returned. This is an issue we've observed in many titles over the year, especially in games like Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 on the base consoles. But let me run down what's going on again. Essentially, while the frame rate averages out to 30 frames per second, the frame times are uneven. Frames are basically presented out of order in short bursts. So, for instance, you might have a new frame, followed by a duplicate frame, followed by a new frame, immediately followed by yet another new frame, followed by two duplicates. It sounds confusing, but really, with a normal 30 frames per second cadence on a 60Hz display, you should have a new frame, followed by a duplicate frame, followed by a new frame, followed by a duplicate frame, and so on. What this basically means for the player is that you get a persistent stutter as you move the camera around. In this case, I sent a message off to the development team to alert them to this issue, and the team is in fact looking into it. We've had good luck with games correcting this issue via patches, so I have some hope that the same is possible here. But that's not all. In addition, there are more severe dips during specific scenes, usually cutscenes or major transitions like this. But thankfully, it's relatively uncommon during the run of play. Whether this bothers you or not will vary from person to person, but well, there it is. Still, if the bad frame pacing is corrected, it should wind up running very consistently during normal play, which ultimately is the goal. As for the Xbox Series S then, well, it's exactly the same situation. It has incorrect frame pacing and occasional pauses, but otherwise it hits the target of 30 frames per second. Again, hopefully this can be corrected going forward. Speaking of corrections, I also noticed this strange visual issue from time to time, basically flashing colored pixels. So as with bad frame pacing, I raised this issue with the development team and was told that it is actually being worked on right now. So if you run into it, don't worry, it's not your system. Also, I did test the game when running in split screen, and I found that the performance was exactly the same as it is during the full screen segments. Bad frame pacing is still there, but it otherwise hits the average of 30 frames per second during normal play. So the more demanding dual viewport display does not negatively impact the frame rate, which is important. So at this point, we have a good idea about the game's performance, the visual quality across consoles, and its visual style. But there's another key element I think warrants discussion, and that is audio. No horror game is complete without a proper soundscape to back it up. To that end, Bloober Team has opted to divide the composition duties between two composers. The real world is handled by Mr. Rakowski, who has previously worked on Bloober Team projects, while the spiritual tracks are handled instead by Kensei Sacred Fist and Silent Hill composer Akira Yamaoka. The result is remarkably atmospheric and rich. The mix of these beautiful, often haunting tracks combined with the superb surround sound implementation make for a powerful soundscape indeed. More than the visuals, perhaps, the sound really helped pull me into the game world. I highly recommend playing this using either a nice surround sound setup or at least a pair of high quality headphones for the best experience. And experience it you should. While there's no doubt that the medium is somewhat rough around the edges, it's still a beautiful and memorable horror adventure. It's important to realize that this is a slow-paced, thoughtful game, not an action title. I also think it's the best game the team has produced to date, free from many of the inconsistencies which plagued previous games. So yeah, if you enjoy horror games, adventure games, or anything like this, I definitely recommend giving it a shot. My only hope is that the technical issues raised in this video can be corrected in due time. But that brings us to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, as always, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell for instant updates from Digital Foundry, and find us on Twitter. We'll see you next time.
A gaming icon evolved. Logitech's renowned G502 mouse joins the ranks of the world's most advanced gaming mice with the release of the G502 Lightspeed, featuring ultra-fast wireless connectivity and reliability with performance trusted in competition by esports pros. Featuring the next generation Hero 25K sensor and PowerPlay compatibility, this is the ultimate rendition of the celebrated G502 mouse.